It's all yours.
All right. Derek, will you put that slide on that has the instructions?
Yes.
So I want to welcome everybody to our second in a series of what we're calling ProTechTalks now. We've got a awesome panel of some industry experts, and then I'm a tag along. But I just wanted to kind of go through a little bit of the logistics. You can see them there. Everybody's muted. If you've got a question, we had a bunch, I think 70 or 80 questions that were actually submitted when people registered. So we kind of tried to group some of those, and we'll use a lot of those. But if you have something that triggers from the conversation, submit it in the chat. We've got a couple people that are designated that'll try to capture those and alert Buddy, and he'll pose those questions as they come up if possible. We also will have a poll. I think there's 4 poll questions you'll see. One will be up here shortly. You'll just want to click on your answer to that poll, and then we will share the results of all of the responses a few minutes after the poll is posted. And then a lot of the Q&A will be dealing with that. And we'll also, we've asked each of the panelists to also add a little bit of insight into their view of the poll. You should be getting one right now. I'm going to answer it. So it gets rid of that. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and do an introduction of a couple of the panelists. By the way, Buddy Woodruff will be our moderator. And first panelist I'll introduce is Lance Robertson. He's a Texas A&M graduate. He's currently the Chief Operating Officer at Endeavor in Midland. And prior to that, he was Senior Vice President of North America at Marathon. And I've had the opportunity to work with Lance over the last 15 plus years. And I think everybody's going to be really excited to hear his view of things in the industry. So thanks for joining us, Lance. Second one is Dr. Nathan Meehan. Probably doesn't need much of an introduction, as we could really say that for all of the panelists. He's currently president of Gaffney, Cline and Associates, was the 2016 president of Society Petroleum Engineer. He holds a multitude of degrees of physics in Georgia Institute of Technology, a Master of Petroleum Engineering from University of Oklahoma, and a PhD in Petroleum Engineering from Stanford. He's got 42 years of experience. I first met Nathan back in Corpus Christi. I had the opportunity to work for him on several different times, and he never got rid of me. I'm not exactly sure why, but I somehow weathered the storm. And he is currently, or he just recently received the World Oil Lifetime Achievement Award and the Petroleum Economist Magazine's Legacy Award. So thanks, Nathan, for joining us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Buddy, and he can introduce the last 2.
Okay, it's my privilege to introduce the next 2 panelists. I'll begin with Mukul Sharma. Mukul is professor and holds the Texas Moncrief Chair in the Department of Petroleum Geoscience or Geosystems Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin, where he has been serving for the past 35 years. He served as chairman of the department from 2001 to 2005. He has too many technical articles and organizations that he's formed and created and been a part of to list them all. He has a Bachelor of Technology in Chemical Engineering degree from the Indian Institute of Technology, and he received his MS and PhD in Chemical and Petroleum Engineering from the University of Southern California. Mukul, I assume that your parents didn't pull any strings to get you into Southern Cal, did they?
Well, no, I was not on an athletic scholarship, I can assure you that.
Okay, I'm just checking, some of that going around here. Okay, good. Among his many awards, Dr. Sharma is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering. He's been the recipient of numerous SP awards, including the John Franklin Carl Award, the Lucas Gold Medal, and what some call the infamous Lester C. Urine Award. That one usually receives a couple of chuckles when you say, I got the Urine Award from SPE. And he has served on the editorial boards of many journals, and he's a consultant in many different areas within the industry. And it's a privilege to have you with us, Mukul. Thank you very much for taking the time to spend with us.
Thank you, buddy.
And then last but not least, Dick Leonard. Dick has a petroleum engineering degree from UT Austin. I did some time at UT Arlington. We used to call UT Austin the South Campus. So Dick graduated from the South Campus. He started with Pennzoil in Corpus Christi and later joined Champlin, which later became UPRC, where he worked with Nathan, amongst other things, during the infancy of water fracs in the Cotton Valley and the famous "we don't need no stinking prophets" era. He has been with ProTechnics for 20 years and is currently the Director of Engineering Diagnostics at ProTechnics, which is a division of Core Labs. So with that, I'll turn it back to Dick.
Okay. Well, and we should have the results of the first poll. So, you know, the question that was submitted to the audience was what would be the primary consideration for which wells are shut in? And no real surprise here. I think well performance, as far as poor performers or high water cut, got the biggest percentage with 56%. The other two that got significant amount of votes was based on where the well is in its production life, either recently brought on or near the end of the life, or whether it was perceived to weather the shut-in better. So with that, I would like to maybe get the panel to chime in. And so Mukul, maybe we'll start with you. Do you have a view of you know, either what you're hearing from the statistics from the group here or what your view of things are?
Well, I think the first two choices there are both good ones. The first one is pretty obvious. If you have a poor performer with lots of water production, then that's one that you might shut in. But I think the second one is not so obvious, and that's I think choosing a well based on how well it's going to perform after you've shut it in and trying to bring it back on is really important. Because if you shut in a well that loads up with water and doesn't come back nearly as well as it was doing before, then that could be a real bummer. So I think choosing wells that you think are going to be unloading fairly efficiently when you bring them back on is a really important consideration.
Okay, Nathan.
Hey, yeah, actually, I had a little more experience in this, principally with gas wells. If you recall, way back in the late 70s and through the 80s, there were times when we have to shut back and curtail gas production on a routine basis. And as I got to a level where I could actually make some decisions, I noticed that the field people preferred to shut in some of the best wells, and their experience was those wells came right back. They didn't have any problems. But if they would shut in low volume wells, like Mukul was pointing out, wells that had a tendency to load up, particularly gas wells, then they'd have to go out and do a lot of work. And so what we did, and actually this is a time I was working with Dick in Corpus, we built a kind of an economic model. And we basically generate, you know, what was the net cash flow that we got from every single one of these wells? And let's start, you know, if we have to cut back X volume, let's start from the least profitable, go all the way up to the top. And then as we matured that, what we found out was if you look at the total cost, we were better off essentially cutting off whole groups of wells. In other words, particularly for gas wells, you know, this whole gathering system, every well associated with that, will shut that group down. And that actually generated the largest net present value increase for us if you had to shut, or the least decrease, if you will, because we were able to cut out a whole chunk of operating expenses. It turns out if you cut out wells here, here, and there, you don't cut back on much of your labor and other costs. You had to take a whole delta out of the operating costs to make that there. So I would suggest that you ought to be able to integrate economic models of, the profitability here, as well as that idea about how much work has to be done to bring them back on. Clearly, that was a problematic area, and what we found was there would be, some of the poorest wells took a great deal of effort to bring those back. So I think you've got those two things to balance.
Okay, Lance, same question, a little different spin here. In the UK, it's been reported that some operators have determined that it's more judicious to continue to run their operations and facilities at a loss right now than to risk the potential reservoir damage from shutting in wells. Is that a consideration when you make your determinations about well shut-ins? How do you handle the cash flow aspects of this, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Sure, buddy. I mean, I think reservoir performance and or damage for shut-in is a concern anytime you're going to shut a well in. And so it's very reservoir dependent. It's dependent on the life of the reservoir. Late life, very low pressured reservoirs are going to behave very differently than early life reservoirs that still have substantial pressure in them. And so that energy in the reservoir makes, a big difference. And I think you have to take that into account. I think Mukul and Nathan both made really elegant points that we take into consideration very much. I might actually turn a little bit and say there's a lot of commercial implications to a shut-in decision. We always look at the cash flow, and in a low-priced commodity environment, we're probably more interested in eliminating, cost in the field level than we are in maximizing revenue, because the cost is more important to a certain degree. And then sort of the operational aspects come next for us. So if we have a typical West Texas pad, we have 3 horizons developed in a 2-mile by half-mile wide unit. So we have 9 wells in 3 different levels, so 3 in each reservoir. In our case, that's typically two benches that are on gas lift and 1 bench that's on an ESP. And so from a cost perspective, we would find it most effective to shut in the wells on gas lift so we can put the compressors on standby. If we shut in 8 of the 9 wells anyway, we probably don't have enough supply gas to run the compressor anyway. And then we'll run 1 of the wells of the 9 in the example if we want to shut in the other 9 on an ESP, because we can do it very easily and manage it. The second commercial implication, beyond the operations would be, what your lease status is. The majority of our units are pooled. And so in that example, 1 well would hold, the entire unit for us. And if you're an allocated unit, it may take several wells. And so we have to be very careful in the shut-in frequency to maintain the continuity of ownership in those. And so I think that's a critical part. That's our most important asset, our leases. And so we want to prolong those. So really looking at those 2 things, how do we eliminate the most cost? How do we manage the operations most effectively for the field team? And then above all else, how do we do all of that and preserve our ownership? Those are sort of the 3 big considerations for us. We found, particularly in the Permian Basin, we shut in wells all the time for offset frac interference. And the wells typically come right back on. They do make water for a bit of time, and then they go back to their, some a little bit above, some a little bit below their previous hydrocarbon production, both oil and gas. So I don't think the shut-ins in that example give us a great deal of concern for reservoir performance, but certainly those other factors tend to drive our decision the most.
Well, some folks have suggested another question that's related here. Are there some opportunities for reservoir study and looking at analytical metrics while these wells are shut in? Are there some opportunities? Is there a silver lining to shutting these wells in? Either one of you consider that an opportunity that should be considered? What could you learn from a series of shut-in wells?
Well, we've actually just done that for a few wells in the last month. In this particular case, the latest one we did was a gas well. The initial reaction, of course, was to choke it back. And so just from the choke back, flowing at a particular flow rate, choking it back, and then looking at the pressure transient response after the choke back, and then shutting it in after that and getting a pressure transient response from that. And actually, there's quite a bit you can say from the analysis of that choke back and shut in data if you record the pressures properly. I think this is something that has provided us with a good estimate of the matrix permeability, a good estimate of the fracture area, or a combination of those two. It also gives us a pretty good idea of what we might expect in terms of fluid recovery at the end of when you bring the well back on and so forth. So there's quite a bit of information that you can retrieve from the build-up data, either during choke back or during shut-in. So I think that's the silver lining that you correctly mentioned, Buddy.
Okay.
Yeah, Buddy, the opportunity there is really quite good, because the amount of time you might need to get some of the reservoir data on some of these wells that have the very low matrix permeability and the vast network of fractures is pretty long. There's also a big wellbore storage component. So we don't really do many of those pressure transient tests. And of course, we have pumping systems that don't facilitate that, don't make that easy to do in many cases. But on flowing wells, we rarely shut those in for sufficiently long time to gather that data. I used to joke that we had more papers on well tests in fractured horizontal wells than we had valid tests in such wells. Mm-hmm. But our experience goes all the way back to tight gas, when we would shut those wells in for some reason or other for a very long period of time. We got information that we couldn't get really any other way, and in many cases changed our gut feel about how things were working. So I think it's a valuable time to do it, and it's the only time you get a chance to do it.
I'll mention one other thing, Buddy, that's really important, and that is when you do shut in these wells and when you bring them back on, the interference between wells is something that's extremely valuable to look at. And you see responses in wells that are either adjacent to or one well off from your shut-in well. And that information can be extremely useful and can be analyzed, get you some idea of what the drainage area for the well might be, and give you some indication of what kind of production interference you might be getting between wells.
I'll comment on that also.
Okay, go ahead, Dick.
A lot of the work we've been doing diagnostically is on, spacing evaluations and overall drainage area evaluations. And I think typically, as Nathan said, we're not shutting these wells in on a very regular basis, but I think as part of this process, if wells are being potentially shut in, Lance brought up the concept of always making sure you've got something on the pool that's producing, catching additional samples where we've run our tracers. In fact, we're reaching out to all of our customers right now with any project that we've been involved in the last 15 months. The idea, if you've got it on a shut-in list, the idea is catch a sample before you shut it in, and then catch a sample immediately after, and at the same time be monitoring pressures from all those offset wells. So I think there is a really opportunity here. And if we'd had this talk, in fact, I know Lance was involved in several 6 months ago. The hot topic was fracture-driven interaction. That's what everybody wanted to talk about. And I think we never dreamed we would have the opportunity maybe to do some more sophisticated analysis into what really these interactions are.
Yeah, Dick, we're actually hoping you guys will give away that analysis for free in the low commodity environment.
We will definitely
Cutting out on us. Lance, you're breaking up on us here.
Yeah, speaking as another service company employee, Lance, I'll tell you that we've been giving it away for free for a long time.
There you go. That's right.
But hey, Lance, just to really comment on that, our thought process is, there's several places where we think we can help, and we're not going to make cost the the controlling thing there. Yeah, we have to make a living and stuff, but the reality is we feel like the opportunity here is so awesome that, you know, we definitely work with everybody on that. And so it's not cost prohibitive.
Yeah, I think Mukul and Nathan described the work really well, and that's exactly what we're planning as an operator. We've got gauges in probably 60% of our wells, some downhole courts, you know, some with ESPs. And so we run rate transient analysis on a regular basis on single wells and groups of wells, trying to look for data and patterns. And now we can take that work and compare it to pressure transient work from buildup. I think, you know, I don't know if a month or a few weeks is a long enough shut-in to get a really good quality data. I think for the first time, we're going to have a chance to find that out. You know, if we have some wells curtailed due to price and or lack of market demand. So we're going to do the best with that, right? And all this data, in this case, unanticipated, are great opportunities to keep our technical staffs busy doing fantastic projects and work that we can learn from and prepare for and progress in the future. As development activity moderates, people always ask, well, what are people going to do? And I'm like, well, last time I checked, you know, we have terabytes worth of data we haven't had time to look at. So let's go look at that data. Let's capture some new data and let's utilize that to be better prepared, you know, for our developments in the future. What's the right spacing? What's the right stimulation design? You know, what are the right combinations? So we're going to use this as a great, you know, learning laboratory during this time, you know, into it. And, you know, we rarely get downhole shut-in data because, you know, at a higher oil price, no one ever wants to shut a well in.
Okay. All right. You're going to shut a well in. You're trying to make a decision as to which wells you're going to shut in. You make a decision. Are there any steps you might take to ensure the quick recovery of the well once you bring it back on? Are you going to like inject gas? Are you going to do anything? Inject some sort of a particulate control agent, water block agents, anything that you might do to prepare that well to be shut in and reopened?
Well, I'll start with this one as the operator in the group. You know, we have some wells that we're taking some steps in, some that we know will be shut in, you know, for potentially longer than others. And we're going to go ahead and treat those wells down the tubing and on the backside to protect the tubulars, pickling, if you will. For the majority wells, buddy, we're not going to take a substantial amount of effort because it takes a lot of time and energy and cost to do those things. And we don't expect those wells to be off for very long. I think most of our wells will produce every month for a few days just to make sure we have volumes recorded at the state level to demonstrate lease continuity. And, you know, with those startups every month or every other month, you know, we're not sure we'd see a lot of benefit from it taking a substantial amount of work to prepare for. I might also couple that with just our view. I mean, the wells get shut in for a facility downtime or an offset frac, some event in any way during its early life. And our experience has been the wells routinely return to production very easily in West Texas, either on gas lift or on ESP. We've had virtually no issues with wells, even 2-3-year-old wells that, you know, might otherwise be relatively pressure depleted tend to restart very easily in our experience.
Okay. All right, let's change the topic a little bit. The question to you is, how does technology and innovation survive in this low price environment? What type of experience have you had to try to take advantage of this time to develop new technologies, new innovations? Is any of that being done? Do you feel the need for that? What, in your opinion, should be done to make sure that we don't lose the grasp of technological advances during this downtime?
Well, buddy, I'll take a crack at that. Let me answer the earlier question a little bit as well. One thing I always encourage people to do when they're shutting in wells or bringing them back on is, especially when they're bringing them back on, is to bring them back on slowly. And I think a lot of people, you know, crank that choke open. I think just doing it in steps, even if it's over a period of a few hours, is a really good idea. there's some valuable information that we've gotten from choking back wells as opposed to just shutting them in right away. So you run it at a particular choke size, you choke it back, and then you run it for maybe a couple of days, and then you choke it back some more. That transient data actually can be quite valuable. I think that's something we've used quite a bit. In some wells, depending, of course, the answer to your question depends on the kind of well you have, but using some sort of chemical inhibitors, maybe it's a waxy well, paraffin inhibitors or corrosion inhibitors and so on, are a really good idea. Of course, they cost money, and so it's going to be an economic decision more than anything when you try to do that. The second question you had was on technology. I mean, we're in the business of developing technology, and so we continue to do that, and we're in the fortunate position where we can continue to do that. It's actually given us an opportunity to step back and look at what we're developing and ask people who we normally have a hard time getting the attention of because they're so busy with their wells, and ask them what kind of things they're looking for. And I think those conversations have been extremely valuable. So I think it's a great opportunity to actually go back and step back and look at what you're doing and be able to work on the most important things first. And we've really been extremely active, and there's at least 5 or 6 projects we're involved in that fall into that category right now.
Hey, Mukul, before we move on, I guess I'm really for everybody, what's your view of the potential in terms of any kind of IOR, EOR type of, improving the recoveries of these wells as part of a shut-in process? I know I've read stuff lately about, injecting field gas to try to really overcharge it with the idea of possibly improving recoveries. Any feeling anyone has on that?
I think that's an extremely important and useful thing to consider, depending on where you are, whether you're in West Texas or in the DJ Basin or wherever. But if you don't have a good market for your gas, I think that makes a lot of sense to do. And I think there's been some pretty good results, especially for the huff and puff approach. Sweeping the reservoir with the gas has been less successful because you have a hard time containing where the gas is going. But I think there's been a lot of work that's been done. As Nathan was saying, more papers than actual field demonstrations that have been done yet. But I think in the next few years, there's probably going to be quite a few things published. We've been involved with several of these, all the way from the Eagle Ford to the Bakken, where people have done huff and puff type treatments, and I would say reasonably successful treatments. And we're learning more and more as we go forward. So I think that's a great opportunity as well.
In following up of that, not only is natural gas injection, I think, of course, you've got to have a couple of specific reservoir parameters where this makes sense. But CO2 injection, ultimately, I think if we were in a position where we had a price on carbon, I think that we believe that the modeling results show CO2's also got a lot of potential. So while natural gas is practically free now, or it's very cheap, CO2, if we had the appropriate price, could also do quite a bit, we think, in that huff and puff model. And some of the experiments that have been done so far have shown not only increased oil recovery, but a substantial amount of the carbon is sequestered in the reservoir. So there's a potential solution there to get a chance to green up our oil and gas and decarbonize some of the industry.
Dick, I've had a chance to build a couple of cyclic gas injection projects, and I'd say in general, they were very encouraging in early results. Scaling them up to something that's commercially attractive, is a different set of challenges in a way. We've been looking more recently, I would say, on a preliminary basis at the opportunity to inject field gas, either raw or stripped out, with the membrane system, partially the liquids. Not as a solution for shut-ins, but really as, in West Texas for the last year and a half, maybe a bit longer, gas gathering has been, failing to meet the full need, or facilities would go down. So it'd just be an opportunity to minimize flaring overall. So we're looking at that as a solution. How can we deploy it on batteries? It turns out as a practical matter, it's not super easy because it takes a unique compressor to inject gas, because if it's an early life well, you're going to have to inject approaching reservoir pressure to get it back in there at some level. So you don't just find that machine kind of off the shelf anywhere. You've got to order a unique machine for that can withstand the loads required for that. But I think it is a technology that needs to be explored further. If it could be deployed at large enough batteries, you could see the value of it and not having the flaring, having that gas for later, as well as the pressure maintenance to deliver the oil, in the early life of the well, early years. So I think it needs to be more. I wish it were easier, right? Having built those machines, my experience is, those are just unique compressors that someone only builds if you ask them to build it. And so you've got to plan well in advance for it. And the opportunity to do it on a relatively short notice is pretty challenged.
Very good. Anybody else want to offer any suggestions as to how we can continue the technology improvement, technology development during this downtime?
Buddy, if I could, I would say, and this is what we've given, sort of the message to our own team, is that this is the gift of time. And, we've taken our drilling and completions team and we've separated them into a smaller subset that's still continuing to execute at a lower activity level. The remainder of that team is doing after studies and work that we've meant to get to for the last 2 years and didn't get around to. We own all the software licenses and applications. And with a really lean team, you find that some of those things kind of wait on the back burner, perhaps longer than you'd like them to. And then person by person through our subsurface teams, we've given everybody technical projects that we need to do anyway. And so I think within those technology, rises up, we're going to do more rate transient work, more pressure transient work. We're going to go back and look at a bunch of completions with a completions geologist to put things together from a different perspective and just try to integrate a lot of the work we've been doing, but perhaps not deep enough or not as integrated as we would ideally like to over the past couple of years. And so I think it's a great opportunity to really leverage all these people resources we have that have taken a really long time for us to assemble, put together these great teams and keep them really focused on helping us create value for the enterprise in the long haul.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions that have come in on the chat lines here from the audience. Okay, you want to do the poll question first, Dick? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, we can just, everybody respond to that and then go ahead and ask your question. And after we get through this question, I'll give the results. So,
okay.
When will the industry be at $50 a barrel again?
Yeah, I expected some grins here when this one came up. Not $30 a barrel, not $40 a barrel, $50 a barrel.
Okay, go with the question.
Okay, there's no other option here. It's got to be one of those. Okay, here's some of the questions from the chat group. Sort of specific questions again about shutting in wells. One is to do an interference test by shutting in multiple wells in steps. What is the amount of time between shut-ins you recommend to see a response in a well? 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours? And second one, any special considerations to take for wells you will be shutting in? And would you recommend the leasehold well be an inside well or an edge well in the well population? Inside, outside, edge wells, and how long do you suggest trying to get some of this valuable data? How long to shut it in? 24, 48, 72 hours? Kind of two separate questions.
Actually, the middle question was special considerations for you take for wells you will be ducking, so drilling and not completing. Is there anything unique you want to do with ducks?
Yes.
Who wants?
Sure, I'll start. I'll take a crack. I want to go in reverse order, Dick. We've got a handful, quite a number of drilled but uncompleted wells as we were able to sort of furlough our fracture stimulation crews ahead of some of the rigs. So for all of those wells, sort of universally, we have taken the opportunity to go ahead and circulate around inhibitors, both corrosion and several others, just to make sure we protect the integrity of the well and what at this point we can say is an unknown time they're going to be left idle before we go back to complete them. So we had to just look at what our typical issues are, what water was in them, what do we need to pump around. I think probably the most important for us has generally been corrosion inhibitor and biocide. We're just trying to protect those wells for what maybe weeks or months, an unknown time frame. For us on sort of the leasehold wells, if it's a pooled unit, we really focused on, operationally what was the lowest cost and most reliable. In some cases, if we have substantial competitor activity in our lease line, we might choose an inside well so that we know the well will produce reliably and or be less likely to hit with an upcoming stimulation. We share our frac programs with all of our peers in basin. And so, ideally we wouldn't want the well left producing for a whole unit to be the one that's going to end up, taking a fracture driven interaction in the near term because you unload a bunch of water. So we sort of take all those factors in and try to pick what's operationally the simplest and the most isolated that we can get. For us, the operational piece probably is the bigger driver of the two, in that, but we look at all the data we have to make those decisions.
Okay, anybody else want to?
Well, I think Mukul should probably answer the timing for the rates. I would throw into what Lance said, in addition to the biocides and corrosion inhibitors, a lot of people will put an O2 scavenger.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much what you're seeing as the fluid that's left in these idle wellbores. And it's, people will check, casing pressures and, the normal operating kind of things on wells. You'll get a little casing pressure on occasion.
On the timing issue, Nathan, I was just going to say that obviously it depends on the permeability, but I will say that there's two kinds of responses that you typically see on adjacent wells. One is going to be an elastic response. As you shut wells in and you make changes to the pressures, you're going to see a mechanical response associated with the closing or the opening of the fractures, and that is evident fairly soon after you shut in. Almost within a few hours of shutting in, you'll see all of these changes happening in your adjacent well. So there's an elastic response or a poroelastic response. And then there is, of course, the pressure transmission, which is a lot slower. That reservoir, if it's microdarcy, it might be of the order of a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, a month. If it's nanodarcy, you may never see it. You may see it after months. Right? So I think it depends on what the permeability is in terms of the response time and how long you should shut in and change rates. So I would say that looking for that elastic and photoelastic response will happen fairly soon, but the response due to the hydraulic diffusivity is going to take anywhere from days to months, depending on the permeability of the formation.
Mukul, let me follow up with you on that a little bit. So one of the things I particularly like about what you recommended in terms of this sort of step down testing towards shut-ins is that you don't have the same wellbore storage problem that you have in typically. And you've got, if you do this over time, if you're able to, because as Lance pointed out, we shut these wells in for a variety of reasons. If we can do this sort of repeatedly over time, I think you see a clear change in near wellbore PI. That's one of the things that's relatively quickly present. What the reservoir permeability is, that's going to take a shut-in that's way too long for any of the things we're talking about here. But this sort of near wellbore PI, and as you see that change, you see a kind of not only fracture length, but fracture connectivity, total sort of network performance near the wellbore. You see PI variations over time. And I think there's some stuff you can elucidate from that in terms of well performance. And you can do some things for selective shutoff or selective stimulation. I also think that some of those changes correlate very well with refrac candidates. So that's kind of the information you might take, but you might need more than one of those step downs over time to really pull that information out.
I agree. Good point.
You want to talk about refracs?
Actually, before we do that, let's share the results of the last poll.
Okay.
We have 170 plus people on the call, and most everybody's not super optimistic. Over half are saying it's going to be a year or more before we see $50 oil. I'm impressed that we at least had a few that voted for less than 3 months. I was one of those, but I do think it's interesting, and I would bet this distribution you see here, if we polled all of the SPE, we would probably get a similar distribution to this. Mukul, Nathan, Lance, any comments on what we see?
Yeah, how would you three vote here?
I voted for the 9 to 12 months.
Hey, me too. All right, cool.
Well, I'll tell you, I voted for the 1 year plus. I track both global and U.S. production, consumption, and inventories, and get a lot of feedback there. The reason we've collapsed in prices is sort of a combination of things, and I think we all know them. And we're not at sort of completely full inventories, but I believe that we are still producing substantially more than we consume. That delta, I think, got as high as about 25 million barrels a day. I think that delta is probably still about 10 million barrels a day. And until we get some additional shut-ins and increased production, consumption, we're going to be adding at a really high rate. And so it might only take, based on the graphs I'm drawing, another month or two before we would really see problems operationally with this global inventory storage levels. And that'll push things down. And then even if we really cut back on production, which is what will happen, if we ever fill up inventory, we will stop production. That's going to happen. Then you've got a period of time where you've got to work off some of that excess inventory before you ever get back down to 50. And you look at the prices, where the places in time where we've had $50 oil, and look at the inventories, they're quite a bit lower than where we are now. And I think that it would be very optimistic to think we could work off that amount of inventory, because as soon as prices start getting back up to 30 and 40, all that shut-in production is going to come back. Lance, are you going to shut in production if you can sell it at 40? I don't think so. You might shut it in if you're having to sell it at 20, but 40 is pretty good. So I'm voting for the longer period, and the main driver being how well we recover in the economy.
Nathan, I would say, what's different in this, cycle versus kind of almost everyone in living memory is that it's driven by, a collapse in demand, versus always before it's been driven by supply.
Right.
And the uncertainty around when that demand recovers to some moderate level to its full level is really hard to know. I'm not sure anybody can really, gauge that pretty accurately. I think that leans toward the long end, because in the interim, we are overproducing as an industry around the world, and we are filling storage. And once you've got relatively full storage, it's going to structurally take a while for demand to pull that down. The first barrels that will come out of storage will be floating, because they're the most expensive.
Sure.
Tanks will come later, and you'll need those price signals to go back to work, first on your ducts and then back to drilling and building new capacity for that. So it does feel, like the longer end is a bit more logical than that. Although I would personally admit this one is the most complex, the most uncertain. Even compared to the 80s, this feels far more uncertain in what the trajectory is overall. Having said that, there are still some odd things going on in the market. We had negative oil prices a week ago, a little over a week, which I wasn't sure was actually possible, but clearly is when you unwind contracts. But in the meantime, you've had strengthening of oil over the last 6 or 7 trading days. And we've had parties that we sell to, marketing parties, regularly actually calling us saying, look, please don't shut in those barrels that are connected over there because we already have commitments to sell those and we really need those. So I think what's also going on under the hood that's really hard to see because there's no tracking of it is how many barrels are already shut in the U.S. And I've seen maybe 300,000 or 400,000 barrels have been announced as shut in. I think the reality is probably closer to 2.5 to 3 million barrels are already sitting on the sidelines because there's a tightness in supply in some places already. And there's just producers have shown a willingness to say, I don't want to sell my barrel at $10 or $5. And so, Williston Basin, lots of shut-ins. Some in quite a bit in Oklahoma. Permian Basin, I think the shut-ins are growing. There's no requirement to actually publicize those or talk about them. So they generally they're just hard to count. And our view is they're actually a lot bigger in the market than people know right now fully. And, in our case, we have the majority of our vertical wells shut in or on rotating production. And we made the decision to idle quite a number of horizontal wells in May, just because the price was really low and we didn't feel like we wanted to sell into that. We'd rather leave it in the ground and sell it at a higher price later. And we're going to see how prices trend for June. But I think, May, June, July, those months are going to be really tough, in the market overall. But, having said that, oil's gone from negative last week, back into the 20s this week. Not that, relative to negative, 20 feels pretty good. But it's a far cry from 50. I think the other side, though, the reason I'm smiling earlier really is that I think the more capital we take out of the system, the longer we're idle in development, and the U.S. is going to decline because that's the nature of our assets. There's a lot of greenfield investments and brownfield too that are going to get put on the back burner for the next year, on top of the $1 trillion in investments that weren't made in the last 10 years after the last downturn. And we are heading toward a cyclical structural undersupply where we may not be able to keep up with demand several years from now. And I think, it could come as at the end of next year where there's just a need for the price to stimulate investment again and put us back to work in a material way where we will not be able to meet that need. And, is that next year? Is it longer than that? It's quite hard to tell, but I think the deeper and tougher this is, there's no question that the structural side on the other is going to be really positive for the industry.
It's a good point. Western Canadian Select crude oil prices really got hammered. I think there's a lot more shut in Canada than people realize too. Sorry, go ahead.
I guess one comment I'd have or follow-up question, are you any more optimistic on the natural gas side? Obviously, with all of the shut-ins, there's a significant amount of associated gas. Do you expect the natural gas prices to kick up faster than the oil prices?
Well, again, I'm going to throw in something really quickly. You will have decreased amount of this associated gas from Texas and the other oil unconventionals. That'll be a plus for gas prices. Natural gas demand is still off. We have a global glut of LNG. People are buying LNG landed in China for $3 an MCF. So that kind of puts a real bummer on that. And as far as increasing drilling activity, particularly say if in Pennsylvania, we don't see the bulk of that production commercial at $2 or even $3. So, $1.75 and $2.50 are kind of the same number for supply. We need north of $3 to really see a big kick in production. And that will mean a big increase in LNG demand around the world as well. There's just so much natural gas that's been found. And the vast increase in number of LNG facilities, floating regas, other things that make it very simple to get gas almost anywhere. We're looking at long-term relatively low prices for gas, better than today, but relatively low.
I think, Dick, I'm not as bullish on natural gas, at least in the short term. Longer term, being, 5+ years maybe, but 1 to 3 years, I would say I'm not too bullish on gas. I will say that I had picked the 9 to 12 months, A, because I'm an optimist in general, but B, because every single time I've looked at this, I've always been surprised by how much of, as an engineer, I tend to look at supply and demand and do things rationally. But I would say over 50% of what determines the price of oil is speculation and market sentiment. And I'm always surprised at how much that drives the price of oil, regardless of supply and demand sometimes. So when things start to improve, they always tend to pick up a lot quicker than you anticipate. And, that's my rationale for being a little more optimistic. By the way, I agree with everything that Lance and Nathan said. So I completely agree with everything you guys said. But that market sentiment can really drive things up a lot quicker than you anticipate. And that was my only reason for picking the 9 to 12 months.
Hey, Dick, in case you'd forgotten, Endeavor's an oil company.
Okay, point made. All right, some of the audience wants to get down in the weeds a little bit, some of these things we've been talking about. So here's one, and I quote, in step down concept before shut-in, can you discern a change in PI along the wellbore so that you have an idea of any remedial action as to where along the lateral to address that remedial action? Are you that good?
Not to my knowledge, no. Maybe somebody else has a better idea, but I don't.
Yeah, the only wells where you can do, where I think step down can be done that way without flow meter type information are, there is a chance if you have distributed temperatures or certainly distributed acoustic sensing, fiber optic instrumented wells, and at least the theory is there. The number of those wells is handfuls by comparison. So the odds of you deciding, so if you have a science well that you've instrumented, that might be a really good one to play with in this time period. But no, that's highly unlikely that you could do that without additional work.
Okay. Here's another kind of down in the weeds question here. And I quote, what are the most important geological drivers in the successful huff and puff recovery enhancement of unconventional oil? I am thinking of effective control of where the injected gas goes and generates the required impact of fracture system and residual oil. Kind of a long question. Should we let them think about that for a while we do the third poll?
We might have to soak on that for a bit here.
Yeah, let's do this. Let that one marinate for a while here. All right. How about it, Dick?
Yeah, everybody should have gotten a poll question. We'll show the results here in just a couple of seconds. It's kind of in line with what we've been talking about the first half of the talk here. What is the best strategy to survive and flourish in 2020 and beyond? So it's kind of a combination of what do you do now, but also what do you do to position yourself for the future? So should have enough of the responses to get a results here in a second.
Acquired distressed properties. I like that one. Are there any that are not distressed right now?
Can you say, can you choose more than one here? Depending on your cash flow?
I don't know. We have to check with the judges on that.
Well, we still have about a few more responses coming in. So, Buddy, go ahead and ask the next question, and then we'll share the poll as soon as we finish this next question.
All right, let's get back to the huff and puff question. What are the most important geological drivers in the successful huff and puff recovery enhancement of unconventional oil? That's just
the most important thing, I think, is if you do a huff and puff, is to make sure that you have sufficient area of contact between the fractures and the matrix. And and that you have sufficient density of fractures around your wellbore to accomplish that. So I think if you have thief zones, or if you have thief fractures, and these usually result from extensive natural fracture networks, that's what gets you is you're not able to put the gas where you want it to. It might disappear into the heel, for example, because of a thief fracture or a thief zone, and that really kills your hub and puff. So that to me is the most important thing to look out for.
Following with that, you know, a lot of times we don't like to shut in our best wells, but I think some of our best wells are going to be some of the ones that are good candidates for this, where you've got production all along the well, and you're actually going to be injecting volumes of gas that are sufficient to bring you back up to near reservoir pressures. Certainly, you know, near sort of miscibility type pressures. So you want to be able to do something that fills all those all those fractures up and diffuses to some degree into the matrix to liberate this oil and to re-energize the system. So geologically, it's not just geologically, it's that interface of geomechanics and reservoir engineering and fluid properties. There are systems we've looked at where injecting gas would be a really poor idea, just from the PVT reactions that are likely to happen. There are places where dry gas is more attractive than wet gas. So it's I don't think there's any one. I don't think we've matured this to where there's any one driver. You know, it's kind of like asking me what would the main driver be for successful water flooding. Well, you know, there's a lot of drivers that are essential for successful water flooding. There's no one thing, and there's no one thing that controls EOR in unconventionals. And frankly, as Lance rightly pointed out, we have a lot more successful and encouraging pilots than we have large-scale implementations. And there's a fair number of complex issues that are surface issues and other things that are associated with that. So.
Yeah, well said. It's really complex. You got to do your homework and look at everything. The PVT is important. The time from first production to first injection, you know, the depletion, there's just so many things that I don't think rule of thumbs can do justice to any sort of enhanced oil recovery. It's you know, be really, really thoughtful and careful in your candidate selection and do all the work around it. And I think Nathan said it really well. There's just a lack of published data in general about large scale implementations. You know, having a 5-well pilot group is really different than having, you know, 2 or 3 square miles under, you know, rotational cyclic gas injection. And I think we will learn as we go. But having said that, I'd say I'm really optimistic. I mean, our recovery efficiency is very low from primary drainage in unconventional wells. And all of the cyclic gas injection I've done have been in unconventional reservoirs. And it, you know, it looks like you can get several percent more oil out of the ground for a relatively modest, you know, investment in the valving and manifolding and a compressor. And so can you scale that up to work? I think an industry question will be, not unlike decades past, will the operator that develops all of these wells in primary drainage be the same long-term operator when it becomes an EOR field? History has shown those are 2 different operators most of the time. Certainly not always, but just my observation that some companies focus on enhanced oil recovery and some do primary. So it wouldn't surprise me to see those properties change hands, and maybe not everywhere, but for those things to happen, you know, in this cycle too.
Good.
Okay, so what's our results there, Dick?
Okay, so the maintaining cash flow at all costs, and that shouldn't surprise any of us. No one really likes the idea of completing the wells in your best acreage, but then pretty evenly distributed between acquiring distressed properties, doing the bare minimum, and developing technology. So you can see there's some people that are really thinking further down the road, but the vast majority are really more concerned of surviving today. So Any comments from any of the panelists?
Well, I'll kick it off. I would have voted for none of the above or other here, and I'll tell you the reason. As AI tools have been developed, a lot of operators, a lot of consulting groups like us have been able to essentially do reserves on every single well in a basin. And we do economics on every single well in a basin. We can look at it, dice it by operator, by timing, and all the various approaches. And we have seen, particularly as you go to Bakken, Eagle Ford, a little more complex in the Permian, but there's there've been a huge number of poor wells. And when we look at the number of frac stages and the amount of completions, and on those rare occasions we do have production data along the well, we see significant intervals where there's poor completion contributions from intervals that we've put a lot of sand and water into them. So if you could eliminate drilling all your crappy wells, if you could eliminate bad frac jobs, well, I think you do more to help you survive and flourish than anything else on the list. So this is the time to understand the geology and the completion practice that drove your failures. Why are they unsuccessful? Now you're going to find some places that you have an answer that means you can go back and fix that well when the price is right. And sometimes you're going to be able to avoid those locations. Sometimes you're going to be able to improve how you do those completions. So a step change in understanding. And I think that digital and AI tools are going to be really useful and helpful to process that enormous amount of data. And it's got to be a considerable step up over this first generation of AI approaches that we've applied to unconventionals, where we just take the monthly production and the public data available. We're going to need a big step up from that to solve the kind of problems I'm talking about.
Okay, Lance.
Sure. I struggled to answer this one because I wasn't fond of any of the answers or wanted to pick several. I think in this environment as a resource developer, our company, maintaining the integrity of our lease position is one of our highest priorities. So we're going to focus on managing that throughout. Fortunately, most of our acreage is held by production, so we have a limited number of CDCs or term leases or other things to manage. But I think what you'll see through the balance, particularly the second half of 20 and even early 21, is the activity that you will see on the stimulation side and putting new wells to sales is going to be focused around meeting commitments, whatever that means for your company. And I think there will be some of that will push activity, nudge it back up from where it'll bottom out in May, June, July in the second half of the year. Certainly that'll be the case, for us. And then once you turn from your sort of most precious asset, I think the integrity of the enterprise becomes a really clear, important. We are incredibly focused on shedding costs from our system. So high water producing wells are the first to go, whether they're vertical or horizontal. Minimizing workovers. If you have a 5 barrel a day vertical well holding a lease, if you only need to produce it for 3 days a month, well, limit its production and take that expense out of the system. Do the best you can commercially through your supply chain is something as a focus on cost across that. And then, we're, doing everything we can, in terms of capital, saying, the truth is nobody in North America, maybe anywhere, is going to drill a, high rate of return well at $20 oil or $1.50, $1.75 gas. So it doesn't make sense to invest in new capacities for the sake of returns at the corporate level, particularly when they're fully burdened with your overhead at that price point. So you're going to do the minimum activity in most cases or much less and leave that cash on your balance sheet. You're going to flatten out your production profile as much as you can by the wells you do put to sale are among your better wells because it flattens out your EBITDA and doesn't let it decline as much in that time. And so we're focused on doing all those things to preserve our cash flow. Internally, with our team, we've called that extending the runway, right? Do everything you can to extend the runway and you smooth the path ahead so that we have a really nice clean runway until oil prices, commodity prices start to improve again and we get really constructive in our activity. So we're kind of focused on all of those things for the benefit of the enterprise. We need less, preserve that cash flow by spending less and be really focused on every dollar inside the company. And we've even challenged things as basic as we have a subscription to these two data sources that are relatively the same. Well, it's nice to have both. Let's pick the one that's the better and let's let go of the other and tighten our belt a little bit. And I think that, generally makes sense in family budgets. And I think that makes sense in corporate budgets too. And I think belt tightening is a sort of a natural reaction at this time. Internally, we've built our team internally. What we talked is we're built to go on offense. We were putting 300 plus wells to sales with a relatively small team. And our team only knows that sort of mentality. And so we've had to really stop and culturally think about, how do we play defense? So cost control, avoiding spend, and our team is capable and intelligent and really has tremendous capacity. We just got to help them understand that the company doesn't need offense right now. It needs to be more defensive in its posturing. I don't think that's unique to Endeavor. I think it's pretty common in the industry today. And what I see, focusing on the things we can control, which is obviously not commodity price. As a company, our team's doing a great job focusing on those things and minimizing those costs, managing uptime, being really diligent in all those decisions. And I think when I talk to my peers, at 10 or 12 other companies, I visited with in the last 2 weeks, they're doing the same thing. And so we're all taking that sort of turn to focus on all these other things that, while we manage cost all the time, it's just really amplified, in a really low commodity environment. I think we're focusing on, I expect others are doing the same thing. And I think it will help all of us, persevere through this and be ready for, better commodity prices down the road, whether that's Mukul's 9 to 12 months or Nathan's more than a year. And I think we'll be ready for it when it comes. And how we're going to be ready for it is to be really mindful of managing our cash flows and our lease integrity today.
You mentioned cost cutting. Can each of you name a relatively unique cost savings option that you have heard of recently that someone has come up with that others may have overlooked? Anything that you felt that was unique? Why didn't I think of that? Maybe not.
Yeah, you catch us off guard on some of these. Well, I'll tell you one thing I'm starting to see. We deal with a lot of NOCs and IOCs, and we're starting to see groups, including investors and others, who realize there's going to be a number of bankruptcies, there's going to be a lot of distressed properties, and they feel like there's going to be some opportunities. So there's some collaboration going on among potential buyers who are going to do some consolidation, and we're going to see a fair amount if the greater than 1 year is true, particularly if oil prices stay less than, say, 35 or so for most of the year, you're going to see a demand for consolidation. And you're going to need to, oil companies might go bankrupt, but oil wells don't, PUDs don't. So we're going to see some movement there. And we'll see some innovative approaches to that will be both lower cost and broader in search scope than in the past. People are going to want a specific area, and I think they're going to want all of it in that area. They're going to want a big chunk.
Okay. All right.
So, buddy, answer your question directly. This may not apply to everybody. We own about 10 service companies in addition to our E&P company. Those service companies generally work for us. Sometimes they work for outside parties. And so we have about 565 mostly hourly employees who work in those service businesses. So one of the first things we have done is, for example, we converted our roustabout crews and our workover rig crews to work 4 10-hour days so we can limit overtime, because typically those guys are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And in the interim, as we're doing less of everything, we started going down to 4-day work week for them. And that allows them to 10 hours days to still get out, and do the things they need to without spending too much windshield time. And at the same time, it cuts down on overtime. So you'd be surprised at how many dollars, relatively simple things like that and schedule changes do to help, help the cash flow of your business.
There you go.
And I would just add to that, I think one of the things that's going to come out of this shock that the industry has gone through is we're operating differently. I could see our travel costs dropping considerably because people are getting much more accustomed to doing things just like we're doing today. And I think my hope is that the industry uses some of the things that we've learned in this slowdown and doesn't let them just get put back in the closet when things get going. Because I do see I actually have told a lot of the people on my team, I think our communication is better now than it was when we were in the office. I mean, we're having these video chats 3 or 4 times a day, it seems. And so I think that's something I wouldn't have expected, but I think is something that ultimately can save a significant amount of cost.
Okay, you want to do the last poll question?
Sure.
Coming down the stretch here.
Yeah, the final poll question is posted. Basically, how can ProTechnics as a service provider be of the most value to you in this downturn? And this is really obviously the goal here is trying to get a feel for what we need to be focused on. So I've got an opinion on it, but I want to make sure that we're doing the right things. And Lance kind of touched on this, a little bit, and it's come up several times is, I think part of what we need to do as an industry is work together and make sure that we're being, sensible and maximizing the amount of opportunity to get knowledge while we're shutting in wells, but at the same time do it in a cost-friendly mode. And so, I'm not, I'd love to say, hey, how about we trace all your wells? But the reality is it could be something completely out of the norm on what we have been doing. And that's what we're kind of fishing for. And I would encourage not only in the poll, but if anyone on the call has thoughts about that, would like to reach out to us, see us do something with the data, that's what we're here for. So we'll let the poll run its question. It's polling through, but Buddy asked one more question and then we'll give the results.
Okay. One of the things we like to do when we conduct these webinars is sort of a standard question that we like to ask. So I'll ask it now. It's a 2-part question, but you only have a 1-part answer. The first question is, what is the greatest technical challenge that the industry is facing going forward from this day forward? The greatest technical challenge. Number 1, that's number 1. Number 2, what is the greatest technical opportunity going forward from this day forward? So the greatest technical challenge and the greatest technical opportunity that the industry has in front of it going forward, starting as soon as this webinar is over. And this is not a multiple answer option. So I want a single topic, greatest challenge, greatest opportunity. Who's going to go first?
Okay, I'll take a crack at it since everybody else is thinking about this for a while. So
okay,
I think the biggest challenge we have right now, particularly onshore, is trying to identify what the quality of our completions is along the wellbore. I think we have a pretty good idea of what the wellbore does overall from the production, obviously, but we really have no idea how each of the stages and each of the clusters is performing, and trying to get a better handle on how the clusters within a stage and how the different stages are performing is a pretty big challenge, and do it in a cost-effective manner.
You're talking post-frac, I take it.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Greatest opportunity.
I'll go.
Wait a minute. No, Mukul's got to give the second
I
part.
thought you said it was just a one answer for both the questions.
No, for each question, there's only one
Oh,
answer.
for each question, okay.
What is the greatest technical opportunity going forward?
I think better completions is really the opportunity going forward, and that is pretty generic and pretty broad. But I think it includes things like optimizing the completion together with the pumping schedule in a way that would give you the maximum performance. I mean, we really over the last 5 or 6 or maybe years or maybe a decade increased our production 4 or 5-fold in many of these wells, and I think there's room to go there. I really think there's room to go. I think we've reached the limits of increasing production and increasing productivity simply by putting in more sand and bigger jobs and more fluid. I think now it's a matter of using maybe even less sand and less fluid, but doing it in a way that is the most effective in the completion. I think that's the biggest opportunity.
Okay, you other two have had time to think about it now.
I'm ready if you.
All right, shoot.
We'll let Lance close it. I wish that I believe Mukul's answer, because I feel more comfortable in my ability to address those challenges. Those are the things that I want to do. I think that the biggest challenge, and this is going to be probably unpopular over of our remaining careers, is going to be decarbonizing the energy system. I think ESG concerns are going to become the largest ones. Now, maybe as long as we have the current administration in charge, this won't be as big a deal in the United States. But again, my focus is a little more global in this regard, and we just see compelling needs to reduce venting, flaring of fugitives, reducing methane emissions, all the steps, and there's a whole bunch of them that need to be done to make our energy system decarbonized. That will include carbon capture and storage. So that, I believe, is the biggest challenge. And the biggest opportunity, I think, that we haven't really realized is in the digital and AI world. I think that beyond augmenting capabilities, we're going to be able to considerably leverage what people are able to do. And I think that the advice I have is adapt or be left behind in that regards. And I think that's going to be the biggest single change in how we do business 10 or 20 years from now. And some of the successful companies will be those who really can push that forward sooner rather than later. So those are probably a little outside what you might have expected.
Okay, Lance?
Well, this one's a tough one to answer, buddy. Just one thing, because it's at what level. At the sort of resource space level and the NAM space, I really agree with Mukul. I think the completion efficacy along the wellbore is poorly understood, and it's a tremendous opportunity for us to optimize the value. If we could skip stages that are ineffective and still generate the same well otherwise, we could really be far more profitable. And I'm confident that we have, quite a long ways to go to reach the endpoint of completion efficacy overall, reservoir by reservoir across that space. And my esteemed colleagues that make this easy, but I also do think, from a broader perspective, we'll get better at ESG over time. I don't share the same level of concern Nathan does, because I think it's going to take longer for it to really become a primary issue. But I do think that's something we will all, work at over time. And I think there are a lot of solutions in that. In our own shop, though, we are focused on what he described, which is we need to do better analytics, figure out how to use AI and employ that on all this. I mean, we have voluminous data sets that we just haven't really leveraged to their fullest potential over the years. And our team's capable of doing it. We just need to give them time and tools and let them work on it. I think the same creativity that brought us, hydraulic fracture treatments, I think somebody said earlier, water and sand, that created, the beneficial energy benefits that we've had in the U.S., really in a broader space over the last 20 years. That same ingenuity is in our teams today, and they will find solutions to these things and work on it. It's not in our human nature to say our best days are behind us. My observation is we always find a way to do better, whether it's cost or productivity and other. And so I'm really confident that we will see those better days, because that's just what And we're humans, right? Our teams are built of people who can do better, and they're never going to settle for what we had yesterday.
Excellent sermon. Excellent sermon.
And I will comment, I think to me, one of the biggest technical challenges really going to be on the manpower knowledge side. I am concerned that with each downturn, we oftentimes lose a significant amount of experience, and I don't think this one is going to be any different and could be even worse. And so I'm concerned about the knowledge that's leaving the industry as part of this. And I would agree with really everybody. I think the opportunity is leveraging of data. I think we've got so much data out there, and we've got some capabilities through AI and computers that we never dreamed of we would have had even 10 years ago. So I think that's the biggest opportunity.
Okay, we always.
Go ahead, bud.
Anybody else? Okay, we always like to end with this question.
Before you do it, we got to do the last poll.
Oh, my bad. Go ahead. Last.
Right in line with the comments, the leveraging the expensive diagnostic data. That's something that is definitely a high priority for Buddy and myself and our teams. I think the other three are things that we are involved in terms of helping with cost reductions and looking for remediation opportunities, and also seeing what we can do in terms of shut-in candidate selection. I think the concept there is what I touched on earlier. If we've already got tracer in the ground, we sure should take advantage of it if we happen to be shutting in any of those wells or anything nearby. So, any of you have comments on any of this?
I will. When I first read that, I read that as leveraging expensive basin knowledge. And the reality is that knowledge that we have obtained, that data, those terabytes that Lance Robertson talks about obtaining, those were expensive data points. And it is a crime that we don't leverage those. And so they're not only extensive, but they were expensive. So let's not waste them.
So Dick, in that last poll, I really struggled because the thing I need most as a customer of Core Lab is for everybody at Core Lab to get in their truck and drive from the East Coast to the West Coast and stimulate demand. What's going on there?
I'll have to add that to the poll next time.
That would make a difference, I think.
Now, you don't really have to drive that much. You can just let your car idle, get the same effect, really. Okay, here's the question we always like to end with. And it benefits our audience. As executives, educators, you have subordinates, you have people that look up to you for advice and wisdom. So this is your chance. Your question is, what engineering, technical, or soft skills might you recommend that we as engineers should be focusing on adding to our personal toolbox during this downtime? What would you have your subordinates doing to develop their personal toolbox while they have some time on their hands? What skills should they focus on?
Well, I'll tell you what I tell my students all the time. Have for the last 30 plus years is, I think two things. One is building good engineering intuition, which basically means having a good underlying engineering education, engineering/geoscience education that allows you to develop this good engineering intuition. I always tell my students, I say, do you know why petroleum engineers are the highest paid engineers among all the engineering branches? And the answer is very simple. And the answer is that it is because there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in our business. And you have to make decisions under uncertainty. If you build a refinery, and if I tell you, if I put a barrel of oil into the refinery, I can tell you within 2 decimal places what's going to come out of the refinery. If I drill a well today, I couldn't tell you within a factor of 2, what's going to come out of the well. And it's that level of uncertainty that really, begs for good geoscience and engineering intuition. So making decisions under uncertainty is why you get paid the big bucks. And so and the way you make good decisions under uncertainty is by having a good fundamental education and being able to make those decisions with a well-rounded engineering education that allows you to develop this good engineering intuition. So to answer your question, buddy, 1, develop good engineering intuition by getting a good, well-rounded engineering education. And number 2, have the ability to make decisions under uncertainty.
All right. Who's next?
But yeah, I think, there are lots of ways to answer that. And I think if you want to continue to grow and, modernize your skills, is focus on the challenges that your company needs solved, right? I think particularly in the NAM space, we've already talked about, we need better completion efficacy, how to solve that, how to take all the data we've already used with algorithms and AI, robotic process automation, and use this data and employ it in ways we haven't figured out before or haven't done enough. And so it's just keeping those skills really current in the space. Even, I think Dick was really pointing to a concern in the future that, he worries about having enough available labor to drive the business. But I have to say, I'm not concerned about it in the sense that what I've watched over the last, 20 years, particularly in the unconventional development space, is we do more and more each year with a smaller and smaller team. It'll be these modern technology skills, moving the data around, automating as much of it as you can, and these AI skills that will allow us to keep doing it quickly. Even as a company, I would say 2 years ago, we didn't have enough structure. If we had to work from home, all our processes and workflows probably weren't detailed enough, and it would have been a material challenge. My observation now is it's gone extremely well because we have workflows that govern everything relatively well spelled out. And so whether you're working in your home office or your office, people know what they're responsible for and what to do, and they know what the person ahead of them in the queue does and behind them in the workflow does. And so it still works just fine in that, but these are modern skills and modern habits. So it's just focus on what those modern needs of your company is. And if you can help solve those, you're going to be very relevant to your company today and in the future.
Thank you for that. I agree with everything the last 2 panelists have said. I will add this, that every measure of quality of life, whether it's GDP per capita, literacy, infant mortality, every measure of quality of life, access to clean water, is correlated very well with per capita energy use. And the countries that have much higher standards of living use more energy. And so our jobs as engineers and professionals, earth scientists, is to provide safe, affordable, clean energy for the planet. And looking at all the different ways that we have to make that happen and improve that is what I encourage people to do. People are going to find and innovate in their own ways. Some people are going to be able to make that advance in hydraulic fracturing. Some people will be able to decrease op costs. Some people will find HSE improvements, supply chain improvements, integrating nanotechnology, big data, AI, and that collaborative, innovative process working together and breaking down some of the barriers we've had historically between service companies, operators, consultants, is we're going to have a little bit better way of working going forward to keep the cost down and the innovation level up. So, although I'm stepping down from the leadership role at Gaffney Cline shortly, the kind of things that consultants and service companies do, we've had a historical relationship that wasn't always collaborative. It was often competitive. And I think in the future, we're going to need to do, reset how we think about solving problems and align our objectives better.
And I would just end with, I think there's, and this is completely off the technical side, but I do think on the soft skills, especially, and I've been, shared with most of my team and others, I think there is some tremendous resources out there via TED Talks and podcasts that it's a great opportunity when people are sitting at home to capture some of those, spend 10 minutes, listen to a TED Talk on this. I've been just really impressed with the quality of those presentations. So that's the last thing I would bring up. Buddy, anything you'd like to say before we close?
Well, one of the things that in our previous webinar, one of the executives on the panel, one of the things he suggested to the engineers was to develop more business acumen. Understand how businesses survive, understand how to read balance sheets, understand cash flow. So maybe you'll be able to understand what and how you can contribute to the bottom line, not just do your job. So I think that might be another piece of the learning process that we all could go through now while we have some time. So on my part, I thank all of you for your time, your effort, your input. The industry is clearly blessed to have 3 individuals of your caliber available to address these issues. Thank you for taking the time to do it. And please continue being such great leaders and compasses, technical compasses for this industry, because we need that from you. Dick?
Yeah, and I wholeheartely agree with that. Thank you for you taking your time, and for all the attendees who called in, and maybe we can schedule another one of these, a follow-up with this exact panel 9 months from now, and see if you answer the